You're nothing without me, and soon everyone will know it. Those were the words Marcus Wellington spoke as he adjusted his $3,000 Armani suit and stood in the doorway of my modest restaurant. His cold blue eyes scanned the room with the kind of disgust reserved for something he'd scrape off his Italian leather shoes. My name is Vincent Rodriguez. I'm 48 years old, and I've been running Rodriguez Family Restaurant in downtown Chicago for the past 12 years. It's not much to look at from the outside, just a narrow storefront squeezed between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore on West Madison Street. But inside, the walls are covered with family photos spanning 3 generations. The tables are scarred with the memories of thousands of meals, and the kitchen produces food that brings people back week after week, year after year. Marcus Wellington was my ex-wife, Sarah's new husband, a tech mogul who'd built a software empire worth hundreds of millions, a 35-year-old Princeton graduate who wore his success like armor and his arrogance like cologne. He'd married Sarah just 6 months after our 15-year marriage imploded, and I suspected it was as much about humiliating me as it was about loving her. He continued his insults, telling me he honestly didn't understand how people could eat in this dump. The decor was dated, the lighting was terrible, and he didn't even want to start on the smell, according to him. Sarah stood beside him, fidgeting with her new Cartier watch, avoiding my eyes like she used to avoid uncomfortable conversations during our marriage. She looked different now. Designer clothes instead of her old jeans and sweaters, professionally styled hair instead of the ponytail she used to wear while grading her students' papers. A face that seemed harder somehow, as if constant wealth had calcified her features. I just smiled at them both, the same calm smile I'd perfected during our divorce proceedings when her lawyer was trying to take half of everything I'd built. Marcus pulled out a thick manila envelope and dropped it on the nearest table with a theatrical thud. He informed me that what I could do was make this easy on everyone involved. They had bought this building, he claimed. My lease was terminated as of that day. There was $50,000 in that envelope, which should be more than enough for me to find some other place to serve my food. I felt that familiar tingle in my chest, the same sensation I'd experienced when Sarah's lawyer had confidently announced that they'd be taking half of the restaurant's value in the divorce settlement. It was the feeling of holding a royal flush while watching your opponents bet everything on a pair of twos. I told them that was very generous, but I was afraid there had been a misunderstanding. Marcus's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to mild annoyance. He insisted there was no misunderstanding, patting his jacket pocket and claiming he had the purchase documents right there. This building belonged to Wellington Holdings as of the previous afternoon, and my lease was void. What Marcus didn't know, what Sarah had never bothered to understand despite 15 years of marriage, was that appearances can be deceiving. The building housing Rodriguez Family Restaurant hadn't been purchased by my father in 1987. It had been won in a poker game from a desperate developer who'd bet everything on four kings against my father's straight flush. Dad had always said that patience and observation beat flashy displays of wealth every time. The building had passed to me when Dad died in 2018, along with a collection of other properties he'd quietly accumulated over the decades. Properties that Sarah had never known about because she'd never shown interest in the boring business stuff that kept our lives running smoothly. During our divorce, her lawyer had focused on the restaurant's daily operations, never thinking to dig deeper into the real estate holdings of a man they dismissed as just a small-time restaurant owner. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded document, telling Marcus I thought he should look at this before he got too comfortable with his new purchase. I placed the building's deed on the table, right next to his envelope of cash. The paper was old, creased from being handled, but the Cook County seal was clear and the signatures were legitimate. Property deed for 1247 West Madison Street, Chicago, Illinois. Current owner, Vincent Miguel Rodriguez. Marcus stared at the document like it was written in ancient Sanskrit. His perfectly groomed eyebrows drew together as he picked it up and began reading. I watched his face change from confusion to disbelief to something approaching panic. He stammered that this couldn't be right, that his real estate team had done comprehensive research. This building was owned by Chicago Property Holdings, LLC, and they had purchased it fair and square. I corrected him gently, explaining that he had purchased shares in a shell company that claimed to own this building. Chicago Property Holdings, LLC was incorporated last year by someone who was apparently more interested in his money than in actually owning real estate. I mentioned that I had already contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division about this, as it seemed like he might be the victim of a fairly sophisticated fraud scheme. Sarah's face had gone completely white. During our marriage, she'd constantly complained about my small thinking and lack of ambition. She'd wanted a husband who wore expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and could afford to take her to charity galas where she could network with the city's elite. The irony that I'd been quietly wealthy the entire time, just not in ways she'd bothered to notice, was apparently lost on her. Marcus sputtered that this was impossible, that they had done their due diligence and hired the best law firm in Chicago. The lawyers had assured them everything was legitimate. I shrugged and told him apparently they weren't the best, but not to worry because he'd probably get his money back eventually. These fraud cases usually take 2 or 3 years to work through the courts. That's when Sarah finally found her voice, asking me why I had never told her about any of this. We had been married for 15 years. I looked at her for a long moment, remembering all the times I tried to talk to her about business, about investments, about plans for the future. How her eyes would glaze over whenever I mentioned anything more complex than the daily specials. How she changed the subject to something more interesting, like her book club or her yoga classes or her complaints about my long hours at the restaurant. I told her I had told her many times. She just never listened. She was too busy being embarrassed by what I did for a living to pay attention to how well I was actually doing at it. Marcus had been frantically making phone calls while we talked, his voice getting increasingly shrill as he spoke to lawyers, real estate agents, and what sounded like very angry investors. When he finally hung up, his face was flushed and his perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. He pointed a manicured finger at me and declared this wasn't over. He didn't care what those documents said. He would tie me up in court for years and make it so expensive to fight this that I'd wish I had just taken the $50,000 and walked away. I stood up slowly, straightening to my full 6-foot height. I'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous people are often the quietest ones, the ones who let their actions speak louder than their threats. I told Marcus he had come into my restaurant, insulted my life's work, threatened my livelihood, and tried to steal my property. Now he was standing in my building, on my floor, breathing my air, and making threats against me and my business. I walked over to the front door and held it open, telling them both I thought it was time for them to leave. As they headed for the exit, Sarah paused and turned back to me. For just a moment, I saw a flash of the woman I'd fallen in love with 20 years ago, before ambition and social climbing had hardened her heart. She started to say something, but I simply said goodbye and told her to take care of herself. After they left, I sat alone in my restaurant for a while, processing what had just happened. The lunch rush would start in an hour, and I needed to make sure my staff was ready. But first, I made a phone call to my lawyer, Robert Chen, who'd been handling my legal affairs since Dad died. Robert's voice boomed through the phone as he asked how it went and whether they had taken the bait. I smiled and told him hook, line, and sinker. Marcus Wellington had just tried to evict me from my own building using fraudulent purchase documents. I thought we had everything we needed now. Robert chuckled, explaining that he'd been investigating Wellington Holdings for months. This might be the break they needed to expose their whole operation. He asked how many other property owners I thought they'd tried to scam. Based on what I'd seen that day, probably dozens. Marcus had seemed way too comfortable with this routine. After hanging up with Robert, I walked through my restaurant, checking on preparations for the lunch service. My head chef, Maria, had been with me for 8 years. She'd started as a prep cook when she was 19, fresh out of culinary school with more enthusiasm than experience. Now she ran my kitchen like a master conductor leading a symphony orchestra. Maria noticed my thoughtful expression and asked if everything was okay, commenting that I looked like I had just swallowed something bitter. I replied that I just had an interesting conversation with some old friends, but it was nothing to worry about. When I asked how we were looking for lunch, she told me we had full reservations, plus probably another 20 walk-ins. Tuesday's special was flying out of the kitchen, and that braised short rib recipe my dad had taught me never got old. My father had been more than just a restaurant owner. He'd been a businessman, an investor, and a master of reading people. He'd taught me that the most successful predators in the business world were the ones who looked harmless on the surface while maintaining razor-sharp instincts underneath. Flashy displays of wealth made you a target. Quiet competence made you underestimated, which was often more valuable than being feared. The lunch rush passed in its usual blur of orders, conversations, and organized chaos. Regular customers asked about my family, complimented new menu items, and shared updates about their own lives. This was what Sarah had never understood about the restaurant business. It wasn't just about serving food, it was about creating a community, building relationships that lasted for years, becoming part of people's most important memories. Around 3 o'clock, just as the last lunch customers were finishing their coffee, Marcus walked back in alone. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and his face carried the particular pallor of a man who'd spent the afternoon discovering that his world was built on quicksand. He told me we needed to talk. I gestured to a table in the back corner, away from the few remaining customers, and asked if I could get him something to drink since he looked like he could use it. He requested coffee, black, and slumped into the chair like a deflated balloon. Marcus explained that he had just spent 3 hours with his lawyers. It turned out I was right about Chicago Property Holdings. They were running a sophisticated fraud operation, selling shares in buildings they didn't actually own. I told him I was sorry to hear that, and I meant it. Despite his earlier behavior, I didn't take pleasure in watching someone discover they'd been victimized by criminals. He laughed bitterly and asked if I really was sorry, because right then it looked like he had lost about $2 million. His investors were threatening to sue him, and the FBI wanted to interview him about his involvement in the scheme. I brought him his coffee and sat down across from him, asking what he wanted from me. Marcus said he wanted to understand how I knew, how I figured out it was a scam when his team of Harvard-educated lawyers missed it completely. I leaned back in my chair, studying the man across from me. 6 hours ago, he'd been ready to destroy my life for sport. Now he was asking for wisdom from the insignificant bug he'd planned to crush. I asked him if he wanted to know the difference between his lawyers and me. His lawyers looked at documents and contracts and legal precedents. I looked at motivation. Who benefits from this transaction? Who has what to gain and what to lose? When someone approaches you with a deal that seems too easy, too convenient, the first question should be why they need you specifically. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that they had targeted him because he had the cash and the ego to believe he could waltz in and take over my life. I confirmed this was exactly right. They had researched his personality, his business history, his relationship with Sarah. They crafted a scenario that would appeal to his specific weaknesses. He asked if Sarah was part of it. I shook my head, explaining that I didn't think so. Sarah wanted to hurt me because I represented everything she was trying to escape from in her new life. He wanted to hurt me because it would make him feel powerful. The scammers just connected those dots and provided them with an opportunity to do what they already wanted to do. Marcus sat quietly for a moment, absorbing this information, then asked what happened now. I told him now he cooperated with the FBI investigation, helped them catch the people who stole his money, and hopefully prevented them from victimizing anyone else. When he asked what happened after that, I smiled and explained then he would learn from this experience and move forward with his life, maybe with a little more humility and a lot more careful research. Marcus looked around the restaurant, really seeing it for the first time. The family photographs, the handwritten daily specials board, the way my staff moved with practiced efficiency born from years of working together. He said Sarah was right about one thing. I really wasn't like other people he knew. Most people in my position would be gloating right now, taking pleasure in watching him crash and burn. I asked what would be the point of that. He had made a mistake based on incomplete information and overconfidence. We'd all been there. The important thing was what he did next. 3 months later, Marcus Wellington sat across from me again in the same corner booth. But this time, the conversation was very different. The FBI investigation had uncovered a massive fraud ring operating out of Miami, targeting wealthy investors across the Midwest. Marcus's cooperation had been instrumental in shutting down the operation and recovering millions of dollars in stolen funds. Marcus told me he had a proposition for me, pulling out a folder of documents. Not a takeover, not a buyout, a partnership. His tech company needed office space, good office space, in a building with character, owned by someone he could trust. The upper floors of this building had been empty for years. He wanted to know what it would take to renovate them into modern office space. I'd actually been considering this exact renovation for the past 2 years, but the upfront costs had been prohibitive. I estimated about $400,000 for a complete renovation. Modern electrical, high-speed internet infrastructure, climate control, the works. Marcus offered to fund the renovation in exchange for a 5-year lease at market rate. He also wanted to hire my catering services for all their corporate events, client meetings, and office parties. It was a good deal. Better than good, actually. But I'd learned to be cautious about offers that seemed too convenient. I asked him why. There were dozens of office buildings in Chicago with available space. Why here? Marcus smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, it seemed genuine. He explained that over the past 3 months, he had learned something about himself that he didn't like very much. He'd spent so much time trying to appear successful that he forgot what actual success looked like. This restaurant, my staff, my customers, this was what success looked like. Building something that lasts, creating value for other people, being part of a community instead of just trying to dominate it. 6 months later, the renovation was complete. The upper floors of my building now house Wellington Tech's Chicago headquarters, with 40 employees working in open, light-filled spaces that still maintain the character of the original 1920s architecture. Marcus had insisted on preserving the building's historic elements while incorporating modern technology seamlessly. The partnership had benefits I hadn't anticipated. Marcus's employees ate lunch in my restaurant regularly, bringing new energy and customers to the space. His company's catering budget alone had allowed me to hire 2 additional staff members and expand my menu offerings. More importantly, Marcus had proven himself to be a thoughtful partner who respected both my expertise and my boundaries. Sarah came by one Tuesday afternoon alone. She looked different again, more like the woman I'd married 20 years ago. The designer clothes had been replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair was shorter and less styled, and there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Peace. She asked if we could talk. We sat in the same corner booth where Marcus and I had negotiated our partnership. Maria brought Sarah a cup of coffee without being asked, remembering how she liked it from all those years when she'd been a regular presence in the restaurant. Sarah told me she owed me an apology. Actually, she owed me about 1,000 apologies, but she'd start with one. She was sorry for bringing Marcus there that day. She was sorry for trying to hurt me. And she was sorry for spending 15 years not seeing what was right in front of her. I nodded, accepting her words without comment. She continued, explaining that Marcus and she were getting divorced. It was amicable, actually. They both realized they got married for all the wrong reasons. He was trying to prove something to the world, and she was trying to prove something to herself. Neither of those was a good foundation for a marriage. I told her I was sorry to hear that. She asked if I really was, echoing Marcus's question from months earlier. I confirmed that yes, I was. I never wanted her to be unhappy. Even when our marriage was falling apart, even during the divorce, I never wished pain on her. I just wanted us both to be free to find what would actually make us happy. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she told me she thought she was finally starting to understand what that might be. She had gone back to teaching last month, third grade, at a public school on the south side. The pay was terrible, the building was old, and the kids could be challenging. But when one of those kids finally grasped a concept they'd been struggling with, when their face lit up with understanding, that was worth more than all the charity galas and society events she had attended with Marcus. We talked for another hour, covering 20 years of shared history with the perspective that only comes from time and hard-earned wisdom. When she finally left, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Closure. 1 year after Marcus first walked into my restaurant with threats and fraudulent purchase documents, I stood on the newly renovated third floor of my building, looking out over downtown Chicago through floor-to-ceiling windows. The space housed Wellington Tech's conference room, where Marcus was currently meeting with investors about his company's expansion plans. Below me, the second floor hummed with the quiet productivity of software developers, designers, and project managers building applications that help small businesses manage their operations more efficiently. It was work that actually mattered, Marcus had explained, work that helped people like me run their businesses better rather than just extracting profit from them. And on the first floor, Rodriguez Family Restaurant continued to serve lunch to a mix of longtime regulars and new customers drawn in by the energy and community that had always defined the space. Maria had been promoted to head chef and part owner, with a stake in the business that reflected her years of dedication and skill. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert Chen informing me that federal court had just sentenced the Miami fraud ring leaders to 12 to 15 years each. Marcus's testimony had been crucial, and I should be proud. I was proud, but not for the reasons Robert might have expected. I was proud because when faced with the choice between revenge and reconstruction, I'd chosen to build something better instead of just tearing something down. I was proud because Marcus had learned from his mistakes and become a better person and a better partner. I was proud because Sarah had found her way back to work that fulfilled her instead of just impressed other people. Most of all, I was proud because my father's lessons about patience, observation, and quiet strength had proven themselves once again. The building he'd won in a poker game had become the foundation for something larger, a community of people working together, supporting each other, and creating value that went beyond just making money. As I watched the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, I thought about how sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's succeeding so completely that your former enemies end up asking to be part of your success story. The man who once called me an insignificant bug was now my business partner. And the woman who once thought I wasn't ambitious enough had learned that true success isn't about impressing other people. It's about making a difference in the world, one person, one meal, one moment at a time.